Hello, everyone. Just want to welcome you as you file in, let you know you're in the right place. This is the Safety and Health magazine webcast sponsored by DEKRA. Just going to allow another minute or so for everyone to file in and get settled. Thank you. Well, once again, everyone, thank you for joining us for today's Safety and Health magazine webcast sponsored by DEKRA. You are in the right place. Going to allow another 30 seconds or so for everyone to get settled and filed in. We thank you for joining us. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Safety and Health magazine webcast, Creating a High Reliability Organization, Blending Culture and Human Performance Reliability, sponsored by DEKRA. My name is Kevin Drewley. I'm an associate editor with Safety and Health magazine, and I'll be moderating today's session. Thanks for joining us. In a few minutes, we'll start a presentation, but first, let's review some preliminary items. The views of today's speakers and organizations are their own and may not necessarily reflect those of the National Safety Council or Safety and Health magazine. Any mention of a commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not necessarily mean the council or magazine endorses those items. At the end of today's webcast, we'll conduct a question and answer session. To ask a question, simply click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type your question, and click the send button. Feel free to ask your question at any time during the presentation. You don't have to wait for the question and answer session to begin. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible, but because of the large number of participants today, we might not get to every question. Any unanswered questions will be forwarded along to today's speakers. At the end of the webcast, you'll be asked to complete a brief evaluation survey. We'll let you know more about that after the presentation. This webcast will be archived so you can access it after today's live event. To view this webcast and all of our past webcasts, please visit safetyandhealthmagazine.com/events. With that, let's go ahead and get started. Our speakers today are Rajni Walia and Mike Snyder. Rajni serves as Vice President at DEKRA North America and specializes in human performance reliability and serious injury and fatality prevention. She brings more than a decade of experience leading performance management, organizational assessment and development, and providing human error reduction consultations. Mike is Vice President of Operational Risk Management at DEKRA North America. A retired fire chief and fire marshal in Michigan, he developed expertise in the practical application of the fire code for construction and operational projects. He's a certified safety professional and a certified fire protection specialist. Again, we thank you all for tuning into this presentation. Rajni, whenever you're ready, please go ahead and take it away.
All right. Thank you so much, Kevin. And thank you to everyone for attending this afternoon or morning, wherever you're at. In terms of what Mike and I will cover, here's a brief sort of outline of what the two of us will be covering today. The first thing that we'll do is we'll review some high reliability organizational concepts. We're going to talk a lot about HRO principles. And so what we thought we would do is start off with what they are, how we see them as an organization, and kind of go through there and kind of ground us on those concepts. Then Mike will be taking us through some major incident prevention. So the skills needed, so organizational skills and reliability, what skills do those organizations have? And you'll see some things listed on the screen. We're going to delve into each one of those. We'll link it back to how they connect to high reliability organizations. We're going to talk about a culture of risk awareness, reacting early to early warning signs. In fact, every injury out there is preventable. And so if we can kind of get ourselves in the mindset of detecting those early warning signs and knowing and believing that something will happen, we can actually create more of an awareness of when things might go wrong. So we're going to talk about that. And then I'll be sharing some human performance reliability skills that we kind of go through where it's all about the individual and enabling them to not only better to detect, but to respond to those early warning signs. If everything works out well, ultimately the individuals that are making the decisions are the ones at the ground level. And so what we're going to be talking about specific to those human performance reliability skills are skills that will enable them to really respond and detect better. And then lastly, we'll finish off with a summary and a call to action. So what is a high reliability organization? Now, almost every organization, I would say every organization that we work with across across multiple industries, they all have some inherent risk and complexity. There isn't an organization out there that doesn't have risk and that doesn't have complexity within their operations. So we work across all industries and every one of them has that. When we talk about a high reliability organization, those are ones that operate with this notion that we can get stuff right, and we will have, every time we do a task, we have the time to do it well, and we have the time to do it right the first time. So it's highly reliable, where you're constantly, there are some factors that make an organization high reliability organizations, and we're going to talk about them, but that's sort of what we mean when it comes to high reliability organizations. Now, I believe very early on and throughout this webinar, we're going to want you all to engage with us, and we're going to want you to ask questions, but we're going to start off with a question to you. If we don't mind getting our poll up, fantastic. So the poll is, what are the major challenges you face in implementing a high reliability culture in your organization? Is it limited resources? Is it a lack of practical guidance to implement high reliability principles? Is it the idea that human errors and operational lapses frequently derail improvement efforts, so therefore we stop trying? Or is it too many other improvement initiatives are underway, and therefore it overmines or undermines the efforts that you have when it comes to building a culture of high reliability? So we'd love to hear from you. As you can see, there's only one option you can choose from. Which one would it be? I believe we'll leave the poll up for another couple of seconds, so please get your response in. All right. So what we see, and Mike, I'm curious to get your thoughts on this as well. It looks like we actually have a pretty even split across the 4 categories. So 28%, which is the highest, said there's a lack of practical guidance on how to implement high reliability. And 27% said limited resources. 23% said human errors and operational lapses often derail efforts. And the last one is there's too many other initiatives that are underway. So Mike, what do you think?
So I think we see obviously each one of these as a challenge as organizations aspire to be highly reliable. I would just encourage right in the handouts that we have today, in addition to what Rajni and I will be sharing, there are a lot of pieces of information that we can help you with, hopefully to give you a few inspirations to deal and address with each one of these potential areas of resistance.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, exactly, Mike. I would have said the same thing. All of these are challenges that we see. I mean, if I go back and think through all of the client implementations that I'm involved in, there's some level of each one of these things coming in, right? Lack of resources, lack of really how to do this. And we've seen a lot of organizations go down the path of HOP, go down the path of HR, high reliability organizations, and then yet there's something missing in the system or the culture that doesn't support it. And so it's not due to lack of effort, it's just there isn't really probably a structure in place. So we'll help provide some of that structure. Same thing, if you have other things that get in the way and operational lapses, there's always something happening in the plant or operations that disrupt efforts. That's a derailer for sure. And then it's not uncommon for organizations to have too many things. So where do they prioritize their efforts? So fantastic. So if we move on, what we wanted to ground ourselves is, again, some of the ideology that we attest to at DEKRA. For all organizations that we work with, when it comes to humans at work, we believe that everybody comes to work wanting to do a good job, right? People set out to do a good job and get things right most of the time. We hear the term complacency a lot, and I get challenged by that, because complacency is saying they were willingly and knowingly doing what they did, and that's how they got themselves hurt. We challenge that and say people that get hurt, they're not wanting to get hurt. They do that, and we're going to talk about human behavior and sort of some of the underpinnings of why we do what we do, and that helps explain some of these concepts. but we are going to be exposed to dangers in our environment. In fact, when we get into our vehicles and operate our vehicles, even just on our way to work, and that's a danger that we're exposed to. And then further moving along, as humans, we're prone to errors. Each one of us, including Mike and I, make mistakes, right? And so what we want to do is we want to learn skills and techniques to help minimize when they're going to occur. And lastly, and it kind of goes back to the poll question a little bit, to aid in safe and reliable work, a focus on system is required. We cannot go to blaming individuals. If there's a blaming culture in your organization, trying to build a high reliability organization or culture is going to be difficult, right? Because ultimately, what you have to do is step back and say, where in the system did we create, a gap where this individual was, made a mistake. So stepping back broader than that. All right, Mike, I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right, well, thank you, Rajni. And at the heart of high reliability is the ability of an organization to properly manage risk. And for the purposes of our conversation today, I'm going to use a very simple 4-box risk grid. Obviously, many of your organizations have ones that are broader and have a larger number of boxes, but the fundamental concepts will resonate true regardless of the type of risk matrix that you're using. But if we step back analytically and dispassionately and look at the contours of risk, in this case, the y-axis representing consequence and the x-axis indicating probability, we see that in this case, I've kind of broken them into quartiles. And, obviously those things that represent high consequence that happen frequently would be our number one area of focus. And we would want to be putting a significant amount of resource, attention, and energy to make sure that those risks were properly managed. As you sit back and think about this, the next quartile of risk is really those things representing high consequence that don't happen very frequently, right? And that could mean once every 15 years, sometimes in things that we're looking at in process safety, once every 100 years, or even less frequently. But they are significant events that can have significant catastrophic potential, reputational impact to an organization, or other significant outcomes that are not very desirous. And then if we kind of look at the third priority, it would be those things that represent low consequence but happen frequently. And then those things, if you had any other resource remaining in the low consequence, low frequency area. And so again, right, if you were trying to kind of match where your resources are and prioritize, you would kind of go from first priority to fourth priority. But in today's business world, those things that are in front of us, that are the noisiest, that are the soon and certain as far as what comes to your plate every day, are the things that seem to get attention. Now, the good news is, right, the number one priority is covered in that box, but you see that we end up with a bit of a blind spot in the risk continuum, and this then becomes somewhat of a problem as we try to manage our exposures that represent some of these high reliability catastrophic incident potentials. And so really what we need to be doing is calibrating our leadership style and our organizations to expand that lens to incorporate that upper left-hand box in this risk grid. Now, for more than 40 years, researchers have been really trying to, crack this nut and really understand what does it take to do this. And in much of that research, the benefit that the researchers have is they look at accidents after they happen, and right, we all are very knowledgeable, right, when we can look at the archaeology of one of these areas. And I know for practitioners in the field, this has been an area of great frustration, because what we're looking for is, what are the precursors, what are the warning signs, what are the predictors of when these problems occur? And the game changed in 2001 when Professor Sutcliffe and Wyke from the University of Michigan published their research findings in a book that has been very popular in high reliability organizational theory. It was called Managing the Unexpected. And this was really one of the first times that they took a look at the attributes of an organization and use those as predictors for when an organization might be more apt or less apt to having catastrophic types of events, and what types of things could really be done to help minimize those risks. If there is a criticism of the work that I would provide is it was a highly academic piece of work. And as you try to take the direct output of their work and bring it into the practitioner's environment and working from the C-suite down to the front line, it was very difficult to use the terminology that was aligned with this work. And so one of the areas that DEKRA has brought forth is we have operationalized these 5 concepts or these 5 elements of a recipe that really take the essence of what Professor Sutcliffe and White have developed and bring it in a way that we can operationalize this in our organizations. And so it really starts with being an organization that is risk aware, right? And that is that you make sure that you are looking, inventorying, and studying the hazards and risks that you have. And in addition to that, that you are looking at your controls and trying to understand where weaknesses or vulnerabilities would lie. Now, the great news is that in today's ISO-oriented world, whether we call that aspects and impacts or risk registries, many organizations have these fundamental elements or some part of these elements in place, and they're central to being a high reliability organization that can look at predicting where catastrophic exposure potential lies. It is the bottom 3 that really provide and unlock the tremendous amount of opportunity in trying to significantly improve our portfolio of risk and how it is managed. And the third one is that we work on focusing that despite how good we are at inventorying the risk and looking at the controls, we will never catch everything. There will be changes that occur. There will be situations that we've never envisioned. And we need to build a culture of vigilance where subtle signs and symptoms are identified and are reported for action and follow-up. And so that's the whole part about catching small deviations early and getting them resolved before they manifest themselves into problems. The great news is that in most situations, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of early warning signals. And so our goal is to capture them early, but not necessarily that you're always going to capture it the first time. You generally have multiple times to do that, but you need a culture that is willing to envision that and bring that in to be resolved. The fourth point is operational discipline. And as easy as that sounds, and Rajni will be talking quite a bit about the performance and really what it takes for high reliability organizational performance and the culture that requires. To get it done first time right, we have to have a very modern and progressive view about what causes human error. And once we understand that and we build an organization, we build systems that are resilient to that, both in how we deal with it before and respond to those kind of issues, that's another element of risk that can be managed and oftentimes significantly reduced for our organization. And then last but not least are metrics that matter. And the issue here is I am not at all saying that lagging indicators are ones that we want to shy away from, but we need to expand our view to make sure that we are looking at how do we measure the elements that we're talking about above, right? So how do we know how well we are managing risk? How well do we know that we're catching early warning signs? And how well are we trying to manage our human error portfolios? And so this really expands the need to look at not only leading indicators, but insightful and well-designed leading indicators that help us identify and understand where these potential points of failure and early warning and risks arise. Now, over the last 20 years in DEKRA, as we work with organizations that aspire to be highly reliable, and again, in the context of today, that's really talking about a safety environment. But what we find is that there's a common thread with the organizations that perform well in that segment to really all the other dimensions of business success, right? That's quality, reject rate, delivery, supply, customer satisfaction, employee retention. And what we find is there are these 5 cultural and organizational attributes that seem to be at the heart of organizations that thrive in this environment and do exceptionally well. And conversely, when organizations are having problems, they tend to have one or more of these where they have some deficiencies or outright just are not implementing the concepts in these areas very effectively. And so I want to give just a quick introduction to each one of these. And I'm just going to start with anticipation. And anticipation is oftentimes known as chronic unease. And this is that the organization and its leadership seek out weak signals. And the way that I try to explain this to individuals is if you go into an organization, and particularly in that blind spot area, high consequence, low frequency, we have people saying things like, it can't happen here. It will never happen here. That's an organization that really lacks anticipation. What it really takes is an organization and its leadership to say things like, while it doesn't appear that it's going to happen here on a frequent basis, how can it happen here? And what are we doing about it? And as crazy as that little twist on the words become, you would be amazed by the power in your organization that that simple change will unlock, and the conversations will get much more rich in this area. Now, once you unlock that concept of chronic unease, people will be bringing more and more early warning signs and signals. And the good news is you get lots of information, of which some of them will truly be central to an emerging problem. But the challenge is that there will be lots of other noise that may or may not be central to an emerging problem in the future. And so what you have to be able to develop is a disciplined approach, number one, to analyze these, to take them to a logical conclusion, and make sure that there is a feedback loop to the individual or individuals who have brought this forward to you. That doesn't mean you're always going to have an answer for the individual, but that the fact that the loop is closed has to be part of that disciplined process. Rajni will be talking a lot more about diligence, and this is really that operational discipline part, but I'll just emphasize that a progressive, modern, and appropriate view about human error, causation, and how we deal with that in the workplace is absolutely central for high reliability. Resilience is an organization's pliability and flexibility in dealing with emergency situations. But most importantly, it is about making sure that frontline employees understand their authority and their obligation, that when early warning signs arise, not only must they make sure that they're reported, but in many circumstances have the stop work authority to call a timeout, get the right resources to look at this, and potentially rearrange or not do the work that is there. And that we embrace that when it's brought forth in a logical and integratable way. And that's this whole part about where stop work authority has to come into play. And then last but not least, learning. And this is taking the learning lessons from your organization. And oftentimes these are learning lessons that come from painful events. They may even be embarrassing events, and find a tasteful way in which we can share those learnings and have them be part of our safety moments and some of our other conversations, that they can be incorporated really into this learning that hopefully then feeds anticipation. Because if you haven't personally experienced one of these close calls, near misses, or other events, you may not necessarily be quite as sensitive. And so sometimes the story, and properly framed, obviously with the, again, this is not trying to say be completely, share every single detail of this, right? Because obviously sometimes things need to be protected by attorney-client privilege, but you can distill the essence of this learning. And if that is something that today for you is extremely difficult for your company events and your culture, look at the industry segment you're in, whether that's the Chemical Safety Board or your trade associations. There are lots of opportunities to start this learning process and then build a better way to look inside your company at an appropriate time.
Hey, Mike, I will just jump in. There's a question that from the audience, a gentleman by the name of Michael is asking. So on that slide, it's on the next slide, the chart, the 4 quadrants. Yeah. So does using probability as part of the equation for high consequence events cause people to not take prudent efforts because it is not likely to happen? And would an organization's approach to risk change if you identified unacceptable consequences and made sure those did not happen?
So the short answer to that is every company is going to have a slightly different approach, right? And you can have a certain consequence part that would set a threshold of essentially tolerability or review. The issue you have to be careful about is that as you calibrate across an organization, if you look in as remote as possible, you will always get some type of significant consequence. And again, it could be once in 100,000 years or once in a million years. So you have to walk that very, very carefully. I would tend to be one of trying to build these cultural attributes that we just talked about of anticipation through learning, and really trying to get that understanding of how you get a better lens into the upper left-hand box. And oftentimes people will ask me, where's that line between high frequency and low frequency? Our experience is it's generational within an organization, and that number is generally 10 to 15 years. If you go and you talk to people about, say, somebody falling off a platform or falling off a roof, somebody has heard something about that within the work group, and they believe that that is a potentiality. If you start talking about things that maybe happened within the industry or maybe in the company 50 years ago, it starts to lose its resonating factor with the organization. And we have to really try to augment some of the understanding right through learning, through anticipation in those conversations to make it more real and more live. So again, I would say the emphasis there is on anticipation and learning to try to bring those more into the sphere of conversation. Now, as we put the Sutcliffe and Wyke work together with the work that DEKRA has done over the last 20 years, what's kind of amazing is that when you look at the risk registry and you look at the measurement on the bottom, kind of the filling that makes those other elements work are these cultural and leadership attributes of the organization that we previously talked about. And we truly believe and have seen as you work on implementing these in an organization, the results are powerful, even from simple things like I mentioned, from it can't happen here to how can it happen here and what are we doing? The message that I want to leave you with on this slide is that these attributes, number one, are you can diagnose and assess these. Secondly, you can measure them. And as you measure them and compare them to norms, if there's something that is out of whack or not consistent with what your industry segment or other sites are doing, you can build some improvement plans. And so this is one way in which high reliability can be improved by really kind of focusing on these cultural and leadership attributes. And much like we have,
Mike,
sure.
sorry, if we go back to that slide, someone from the audience has just asked another question. It was saying, they said that they've seen this chart and it was explained a little differently, in that the low frequency high consequence was the most dangerous box because there was a task that was low frequency in that it was not being done often, therefore the opportunity for an incident was even greater. What are your thoughts on that?
So as we'll talk in just a couple of minutes about human performance reliability, you have to really assess the intrinsic risk that is there. And absolutely, those activities that are done infrequently that expose high hazard are ones that merit particular attention. So yes, that type of conversation when you're doing a task analysis is true. This is really kind of looking more at the organizational or enterprise level. So no, good comment, and thank you for that question. So what we find is as we metric and measure those attributes in an organization, and this shouldn't be surprising, but we're starting to find statistical linkages to where organizations that perform well in these areas not only see, and I'm going to use the word occupational safety benefits, but we start to see linkages between the traditional fire explosion and release rates that are there. And in this particular case, lower numbers show weaker adoption of those principles. Higher numbers are more highly oriented and highly implemented systems. And so this is something that's important when I talk about the fact that you can assess and measure. These are some of the outcomes that can be linked to that. And obviously there are lots of other data streams, downtime, quality, turnover, that start to look at where you are able to link into this area. So as you think about how you go about implementing something along these lines and look at a high reliability catastrophic incident prevention oriented culture, we find that there's really 4 key steps that are necessary for us, for a client, to be successful in this area. And number 1, right, are the 5 elements that we've talked about that come out of the Sutcliffe and White work, are they in and are they the backbone of a program? And then as part of that, you need to do an unbiased assessment to evaluate how well that is managing risk, and right, looking for aspects of risk blindness and how well the programs are being implemented, and really how well those attributes that we talked about, the cultural and leadership attributes, are permeating the organization and how effectively they are. But most importantly, as part of that, is to make sure that this sense of organizational vulnerability is extremely important. So that's the anticipation, and linking to that the learning orientation of an organization, so that you can have these conversations about, again, oftentimes low or high consequence, low frequency events, to talk about the controls, to talk about how well they're working, and bring some industry or company experience into that conversation, which will be very, very robust, and it will keep some of those risk conversations and controls alive. It brings, again, things that can be looked at abstractly as, that's a once in 100-year thing, into something that we can talk about on a very, very common term. And then again, helping to build a reasonable set of metrics that matter, that are appropriate balanced scorecard of lagging metrics and leading indicators that give you some overall performance indicators. So before I turn it over to Rajni, this concept about anticipation and learning, I wanted to just give kind of an example of risk blindness. And this is really just kind of looking at recent industrial cases involving asphyxiation. And first of all, these are events that happen actually much more frequently than I think many of us understand. And again, I think academically, we all understand that we handle gases in manufacturing, in laboratories, in food and beverage, and the chemical industry that can displace oxygen and create an environment that can be, fairly rapidly fatal to an employee. And so, back in 2021 in Georgia, there was a poultry plant that was doing flash freezing. They had a mechanical failure that basically created a oxygen deficient and a cryogenic environment that killed 6 workers. But as you kind of look through these events, right, food processing, fabrication and repair, you have to kind of go back into kind of the 2013, 2014 realm, where a traditional chemical industry really has had kind of a watershed event. And today you will start to see a lot of fire protection systems involving carbon dioxide. Systems have created environments where an accidental discharge has caused a low oxygen environment that has harmed occupants and has harmed responders. The piece that I want to just kind of leave here with is every facility has some exposure here. And I always give this anecdotal example. I was involved in looking at a fast food operation that was moving into a historical building, and for a number of footprint issues, had to put their carbonation equipment for soda pop into the basement of the facility. And despite they understanding about asphyxiation and carbon dioxide, no one ever thought, okay, if there's an upset in this carbon dioxide equipment, number one, it's going to fill the basement because carbon dioxide is heavier than air. It'll fill the basement. And when somebody can't get carbonated soda pop, a worker, what's the first thing they're going to do? Go down and look at the equipment in the basement. And there were virtually no controls, no ventilation, no oxygen monitors. It was just something that was completely overlooked. And once we kind of said, hey, let's just kind of look at the inventory of incidents here, boom, that conversation, that learning quickly got the owners and the occupants of the facility to say, oh, we need to do something significant. No argument, no debate. It was really make sure you understand the history. And we brought that as really kind of an anticipation lesson to the table. So I'm going to kick it now as we move from risk blindness to Rajni to talk now about human performance reliability.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mike. And yeah, and even looking back to some of the examples, Mike, that you were sharing, I mean, you can think through, there's a number of other examples that where in transportation, right, derailments and causing leaks and stuff into the community. I mean, there's a number of times where you see it and you think back, wow, it is a good example of risk blindness. Now, you could see here, as it says here, as we think about our operations, what can go wrong? And this is where a lot of the human performance reliability comes in. And I'll kind of link the concepts that Mike was talking about with the anticipation, learning, resilience into how we connect it when it comes to human performance reliability. But yeah, a lot of these things really can be prevented. So if we go to the next slide, Mike, what I'm going to share is this approach that we have that's called making safe decisions. So if we think about at the heart of a lot of catastrophic incidents and this notion of getting blind to risk, it ties really nicely to this, what we call making safe decisions, which is all around how we are pre-wired to effectively make mistakes. In fact, anytime, the first one that we go through is noticing more exposures and detecting change. That is one huge challenge for us as human beings, because what happens when we work in an environment, it might be a plant setting, it might be up in a utility somewhere, it could be underground, you're doing work in mines, all of those things. If you put yourself in the situation where it's your first day on the job, you're going to notice everything around you. You're going to notice all of the exposures. You're going to be quite frightened probably by all of the big pieces of equipment that you're surrounded by. But over time, what happens to this idea in our brain is the more I see that risk, the more that risk if that exposure has never done anything to me, if that big piece of equipment has never done anything to me, so that hazard, what my brain does is it starts to desensitize us to that piece of equipment, that operation that we're working with. And so over time, what actually happens is we tend to notice less exposures, and our ability to detect change does become a challenge. And that links to how we see. And if we see the environment and our inner environment the same, day in, day out, what we don't often do is we don't detect small changes that come up in our environment. And those are two big challenges that we address when it comes to making safe decisions, because there are ways for us to notice broadly and deeply, but we have to be mindful of those things. The next one is thinking. So if you've processed the fact that there's been an exposure in your environment, what you'll do is you'll then have to interpret that. And what we have to be mindful of is when we go into the interpretation piece, there are traps within our brain that tell us, look, I've done this task 1,000 times before. I've never gotten hurt, or this is something that is easy. Let me just do this. It'll be much quicker than, locking it out, tagging it out, doing whatever process that I need to do. And that's how I move forward. So that's where the thinking aspect kind of does impact our decision making. When it comes to doing, what we talk about there is we talk about factors that get in the way of execution. So things like fatigue play a big role. If we have not gotten adequate sleep, it will impact our decision making. It will impact our ability to see and recognize exposure. Memory, the fact that our memory over time gets distorted every time we recall something, our memory of that event our memory of that process or procedure does get altered. So we need to be mindful of that. Distractions play in quite heavily. I mean, we live in the day of a lot of distractions, right? We're constantly distracted by sounds and beeps and noises and, our cell phones. So there's a number of those things that do get in the way of us executing. And last one is stress and urgency. Anytime the brain picks up on any cues, either internally or externally from someone, that we're behind or that we need to get something out, it kicks right into fight or flight mode. And so all we're thinking about at that moment is getting the job done as fast, as quickly as possible. Moving up at the top is another decision that we make is when it comes to a lot of the ergonomic related risk factors, we don't realize that the way we're lifting today, the way we're dealing with equipment today is going to may or may not impact our us getting hurt or us having an ergonomic related injury down the line. So we address that. And then teaming is all sort of, if you think about it, this kind of ties everything together. If I work with Mike and I can see that Mike hasn't noticed an exposure, I want to go and notify him of that. So when it comes to teaming, we want to, the challenges here is that we typically want to go and kind of get along with a group. It's very hard for us to tell somebody that they're doing something wrong. So we teach people how to respectfully approach somebody. So in situations, you can actually be more of an effective team, because if there's ever an incident that involves 2 or more people, teaming is often a factor as to why. Communication may have failed, the recognition of exposure may have failed from one person, and therefore the communication wasn't adequate. So this approach kind of helps us understand better the decision making or neuroscience as to why we do what we do. And when it comes to risk blindness, Mike mentioned this earlier, we need to create a fundamental shift from it can't happen here. We work with a lot of organizations that say, yeah, we're safe, we're very safe. We have we look at our recordable number, it is below 1. And, we haven't had a serious injury happen here. And we have to shift that, right? Even when we look at the catastrophic incidents, the incidents that in my language, I'd say have serious injury and fatality potential, those are always there. It's just that we're not looking for them. When Mike talked about weak signals, we're not attending to the weak signals. We're not detecting, we're not asking ourselves that change of it can happen here, but how can it happen here? What are we not thinking about? If the next injury were to occur, where is it going to occur? And you can see there listed below is that organizations absolutely must expect the unexpected. There's always a change. And, and sometimes what happens is you link it back to the 4 or 5 phases of making safe decisions. Our ability to detect change is often is very difficult. So we have to constantly, as an organization, tell ourselves, what is it that can go wrong here? And so it kind of goes back to some of those questions. Having a culture of openness where we can give feedback, we can challenge, going back to those HRO principles, we can anticipate, ask great questions and really challenge some of those assumptions, because these are often barriers when it comes to us looking at stuff, and these do create blindnesses in your organization. The message in an organization should be how to ensure accuracy, right? Get it right the first time, being agile and understanding that risk is dynamic, and then lastly, learning from failures and mistakes. We often find that organizations, after an incident hasn't happened, if we're going straight to blaming individuals instead of looking systematically and understanding where those breakdowns and that failure occurred, we're not effectively learning from them. All right. So how does this tie in to the concepts that Mike was sharing earlier? Mike did a beautiful job at explaining the HRO characteristics. So I'm just going to connect them back to what I was sharing. So when we talk about anticipation, when we talk about this idea of always seeking or looking out for what's going to happen or what's going to creep up on us, this is where those seeing concepts come in, right? Understanding that we're flawed. Fundamentally, we're flawed. So to say, how did that individual miss that? Well, in reality, they can, because if you're in an environment where you're becoming desensitized to these things, we have to supercharge our ability to see and recognize exposure. Now, questioning, this is where thinking comes in, right? Constantly asking ourselves, prompting ourselves, if something were to occur, how is it likely to occur? If an incident were to happen, how is it likely to happen? What assumptions am I making? So these are questions that we have to ask ourselves. Often when an individual does something, there's a gut feeling or this idea that something doesn't feel right, smell right, sound right. We need to stop and really process that and link that back, especially when it has the potential for a catastrophic incident or a serious injury. Now, diligence, this is where doing comes in, right? This idea that we get it right the first time, every single time, right? When we talk about safety and production, it's how do we safely produce? How do we do things where we're mindful of the 4 factors that get in the way? So that's stress, that's memory, that's fatigue, and that's distractions. How do we as an organization understand how those 4 impact our decision-making and get after those? And then resilience and learning, this is where the teaming concepts come in, right? How are we communicating that when something does happen, or even when there's big changes in an organization, how are we communicating those? Oftentimes, if an incident has occurred in one plant or one setting, it is a high likelihood it could occur somewhere else. But that communication from one group to another or organization wide, that's often where teaming or communications can be improved.
Well, thanks for tying those together. And I think as we come to kind of the closing part of our presentation, I'd like to share one other case study. And this, on the second slide and in your handouts, there's a link to the United States Chemical Safety Board report in animation on this event, because this event has a lot of important learning lessons. But fundamentally, this is a situation, and this happens throughout virtually every industry segment, where you're taking delivery of material A and it needs to be put in a tank for material A, and you have a lapse that occurs that allows that to go, instead of in the tank for material A, to the tank for material B. Now, sometimes those are unremarkable events. They may end up with a quality or other problem, but if those chemicals happen to be reactive with each another, you can, for example, in this particular case where sulfuric acid and a bleach containing compound, they reacted and formed a large cloud of chlorine, which ended up, as you can see here, with 11,000 residents sheltered, about 140 people sought medical attention. And in addition to the property damage, both the trucking company and the facility paid fines of more than $1 million each. Fortunately, nobody was killed in this event, but as we take a look, right, and this comes back to learning, hopefully then driving our anticipation, there are many things that should be able to be thought about before these events occur, if you envision that these can occur as remote as they might be. So for example, simple things like hose connections being unique, so that it would be, again, not impossible, but difficult to make this kind of lapse when the operations occur. To look at and how you work through, for example, shift changes, because distraction, when you think you're doing something or you think you've transmitted it to the shift that's coming on afterwards, there's lots of opportunities for miscues and incomplete information that really cause some problems. And this happened during a shift change. And then when we get back to kind of that operational discipline, this, after the fact of the event, became very clear that the procedures did not match what was going on in the field, right? And those are things that, as part of normal walkabouts or Gemba walks, these are conversations we should be having with folks to say, look, are there things that are hampering you from doing this job? And let's talk at how the work's being done, or, even to audit and inspect in this particular area. And then, if we start to now go back to anticipation, there really wasn't a true understanding about the reactive chemistry hazards in the criticality of the controls of keeping A and B separate. And so, this is kind of one where I would say this is not one of it can't happen here. It was, well, it shouldn't happen here, but it's kind of a conversation that needs to go on about how can it happen here and what are we going to do about this to put good controls in place. One other comment that I'll make here is that as that conversation, as the investigation went on, unfortunately, when this operation started, there were no automated or remote shutdowns. So once the reaction started, the amount of chlorine generated could have been significantly reduced by having a remote shutdown that would have stopped the addition of the incompatible chemical. And obviously, without the benefit of that, the entire load was transferred. And so this is not trying to say this is all about culture and organization. There are engineering controls that get blended into this to properly manage the risk. And so, as we take a look at this, the link is here. There's a picture of what these different lines look like and really how common they looked. And despite, kind of the securement of locks that were shown here on a pre-incident picture, the locks were not in place, and the area that was supposed to be supervised when the connections were made were not being attended during the shift change operations. And so, the key conditions that I mentioned are here. If you're looking for a learning moment or a safety moment, this, among many others, are available at the U.S. Chemical Safety Board website, and I would encourage you to use them as learning moments. So Rajni, I'll kick it back over to you for kind of our closing thoughts and call to action.
Yeah, Mike, happy to. So and I think what you were just saying has a lot of great great learnings coming out of those incidents. And I remember you and I were on a project not too long ago around this, and you could just see that there's a lot of learning opportunities in there. Now we do have a question, Mike, before we go here. The question is, we talked about effectively responding to early warning signs. How do you see leading companies take learnings from incident reports to improve their situation? So have you seen that, Mike?
Sure. So, first of all, if you can get the culture to accept, I'm going to call it transparent and detailed learnings from within your company, the most powerful, right? Because people see the relevance that's there. And so, I've a couple of examples, right? The Chemical Safety Board has a great format for these bulletins and for, kind of animations, I'm not saying everybody has to go into the multimedia work, but a few PowerPoint slides in portals. I've seen one that was called Learning to Reduce Risk, learning from our past to make a better future or to reduce risk of the future. And it's taking these in vignettes, right? I always struggle for good safety moments. These are just ready-made to have a conversation within the organization. And so again, as you're talking to employees, particularly if it's relevant to their work area or the exposures, that is a very, very powerful way to transmit that and potentially even leapfrog or build on those early warning signs and bring more information forward that might show a problem that's there. So kind of an easy way to do that. And there's a lot of different venues. If right now you're not ready in your company, start with the Chemical Safety Board website and work from there.
Yeah. So two more questions, Mike. I'll take one, and then I'll ask you if you want to take another one. So the first one that came up is, does the learning characteristic of HROs include learning from success? And the answer is absolutely. We should be learning from success, right? So if there's a situation where individuals did stop, or were able to prevent something, that should be celebrated. There should be a learning that is shared within that. So 100%, I would say, yes, it does include learning from success. We often say, let's learn from our failures, but learning from success is equally important.
Right.
Now, Mike,
And I would just add that, by publicizing the fact that the difficult call that was made led to a positive outcome, that really builds credibility in the effort, right? Conversely, all it takes is some manager to berate somebody who in good intentions brought forth an event that resulted in stop work, and you will absolutely shut down that stream of early warning signals that are presented. So absolutely, I'm just supporting Rajni's view there.
well, yeah, 100%. So the other question that came up is, what would be an example of a metric? I think it was one of the blocks.
Sure. Yep. Okay, so in conventional manufacturing environments, on preventative maintenance, we'll take a metric of, say, percent of preventative maintenance tasks done on time, and people will track that. And I'm not suggesting that that's a bad metric. But if you're looking for more insight, a much more usable metric would be those activities that are done on testing or maintaining an object, and in the as found condition, it failed the test. So you didn't have an event, right? So for example, you have a high level switch or a relief valve, and as you took it out to maintain and inspect it, it didn't work right. That should be as serious as probably a loss of containment, a major event, and you should be investigating and learning from that, right? And I would say that organizations that use their enterprise management systems to track this and really react to that, the number is not zero. You will find things that are the early warning signs of equipment that's not working as designed, and you need to react and respond to that. So that's one way of taking a traditional metric and kind of moving it to the next step.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. All right, thank you, audience members. And there's a lot of great questions that have come through, so thank you for that. So to sort of round things out and summarize things, that the leadership call to action is really challenge your organizations to think differently about catastrophic events and how you're managing your most serious incident exposures. Don't let them go unnoticed. Really do have it and look at them from a systematic perspective and see what you can learn from them. Like we said, learn from your successes, but learn from your failures, right? And own that. own that as an organization and say, look, this is where we as leaders messed up. We are committed to not having this happen again because we know we played a part in this. The second one second sort of call to action is become a vulnerable leader. Embrace this idea. Ask how can it happen here? We have a wonderful article on chronic needs that's on our website. Please do go have a look. But really, I mean, once it's the way I like to say, once the noise starts to happen. So if you're in an environment where it's not noisy, it's quiet, something's you should be asking yourself why. I mean, if people are not talking, if they're not communicating, the chances are they're becoming a little too uncomfortable. They're too comfortable, right, with some of the exposures that are happening with them. So as a leader, continually ask yourself and challenge your team and say, where is the next incident going to occur? How can it happen here? Understand the role of human performance reliability. So we shared with you a model that said, if we tie it back to how individuals process information and respond and make a decision, in each one of those, you can see easily how it could lead to a catastrophic incident. Mike was talking about the unloading example. I mean, you can see if you're dealing with shift work, you're dealing with somebody who's on their feet for 4 hours continuously, and they drive off with a hose attached, you can see how it can happen, right? So go back and look at how to avoid those things, knowing that part of the design, there's fault in there, right? It's not that, again, not that they probably want to drive off and create all the spill. It's just that's part of how they're wired. They're not thinking about this stuff, especially if fatigue and all of those factors that I mentioned come into play. So the next one is work to enhance the culture, competency, and management systems in your risk management system. So there are lots of things like this one there's a lot to unpack there. If you don't have a good sense of what is causing some of these things, both from a process safety perspective or a human performance perspective, get somebody to come in and do an independent assessment. I know Mike and I often go in, and it's often eye-opening because this kind of goes back to desensitized to our environment. When we're in an environment for so long, even as leaders, we stop seeing what challenges exist around us. So don't be afraid of bringing somebody else in to say, what are we missing here? Because I know we go in and often we'll go into organizations that have a really low incident rate, but we are able to identify and pinpoint, here are the things that you're not seeing or noticing right now. And we do a lot of work around culture, competency building, all those areas. So, I know, so feel free to reach out to us. In sort of summary and closing, Mike and I thank you for joining us this afternoon or morning, wherever you're dialing in from. And we look forward to connecting with you. If you have any questions at all, you have our contact details listed right before you. Feel free to connect with us via LinkedIn. Feel free to follow the DEKRA page and go onto our website. We have a lot of helpful and useful information that we hope you will leverage. So Mike, any closing comments from you?
No, well, very great wrap up, Rajni. Again, I would just encourage you, again, the great interaction with the questions that are here. We do respond to our emails, so sometimes it's overnight in there, but please reach out with questions, or as you go on your journey and maybe hitting certain headwinds. At least we can give you some ideas, or potentially even bring other approaches to the table for you to consider. So, Kevin, I think we'll turn it back over to you.
Yes, no, excellent. Great job to the both of you. Thanks for sharing your insights and expertise. No, we are winding down when we've got some questions in there. So your call if you'd like to respond to one, or just if you'd like to, I know you were just given the opportunity for any closing thoughts, or we do have some questions there.
Yeah, I quickly saw the one on EHS culture. I can, and Rajni, maybe you can take a whack and I can help here. We probably have time for this one. How would you suggest to change the narrative away from this being an EH&S culture issue to an organizational culture issue?
It's a great question. I mean, in fact, every organization we work with, if safety and EHS and ES&H are driving the change, we know that it's not going to be as impactful as the organization having really the operation embracing that there's something that they have to do differently. So anytime we work with an organization, we say the operations has to be involved, because it's an organizational issue. It's an organizational culture issue, not just an EHS responsibility.
And I would just encourage that if you're having defects that are causing pain in the EH&S program, if you truly look, those same defects are manifesting themselves, as we talked about, in other aspects. And I think if you're able to kind of talk in the concept of high reliability and human performance reliability, you can cast a wider net of, number one, the participants, but also the impact to the organization. So that was a great closing question, and I thank the submitter for that.
Absolutely. So yeah, I mean, if there are other questions, I know, Kevin, you all will pass them along to us and we'll make sure we answer them. So please, if you think of anything else, either now or later, you're welcome to email us directly. And the ones that are in there, I see that there's a few, we'll get back to you on those. But thank you for joining. We won't keep you and hold you any longer. Thank you so much for being with us.
Yes, no, thanks to both of you. No, I appreciate you reiterating that. Yes, as stated, any unanswered questions to Mike and Rajni will be forwarded along. And as you can see on the screen, there is their contact information. So sorry that we didn't get to everyone's questions, but once more, we thank you for joining us. As we do wrap up, just a quick reminder about the evaluation survey that we'll ask you to complete. That'll open in a different screen after the webinar, and we really appreciate your input. It's very important as it helps us improve our future webcasts. With that, we do end today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast. We'd like to thank Rajni Walia, Mike Snyder, everyone at DEKRA, and all of you who listened in. Thanks so much and have a great day.
Take care.
Thank you.